All right. Well, hello again to those of you who just joined us for today's webinar breaking down the LDT final rule. My name is Alex Mitchell, and I'm a marketing communications manager with the Lighthouse Lab Services team, and we're really excited to be bringing you this hot discussion today. We have some expert analysis from the FDA law firm Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today so that we can dive right in. First, we have Gail Javitt, and Ms. Javitt provides strategic FDA regulatory advice for leading medical device, diagnostics, pharmaceutical, biological products, and human cellular and tissue-based products through the product life cycle, and has successfully resolved disputes at both the pre and post-market stage. She also has significant experience advising clinical laboratories on FDA and CLIA requirements for laboratory-developed tests. Ms. Java's experience prior to joining HPNM includes serving as a partner in a leading Washington, D.C. health law practice and as a law and policy director at the Genetics and Public Policy Center, part of Johns Hopkins University. At the center, she was responsible for developing policy options to guide the development and use of reproductive and other genetic technologies. So again, thank you to Ms. Javitt for joining us today. And we also have Jeffrey N. Gibbs. Over the course of his career, Jeff Gibbs has developed an extensive knowledge of FDA law, including regulatory strategy, product approvals, advertising and promotion, appeals, citizen petitions, and enforcement actions. In recent years, Mr. Gibbs has focused primarily on advising LDT, IVD, and medical device companies. Based on his extensive experience working with the industry on FDA issues and previously for FDA, he provides efficient, practical, timely, and insightful guidance. He has worked with companies of all sizes, from global manufacturers to one-person startups. Mr. Gibbs has written and lectured extensively on a variety of FDA topics, particularly the long history of LDT regulation. Mr. Gibbs was previously an Associate General Counsel for Enforcement at FDA, where he received an Award of Merit. So truly, we are extremely lucky to have both our guests here today. Can't thank them enough for giving us our time and expert insight. We're going to go ahead and dive into the material here soon, but first I want to direct you to an opportunity for you to follow up with our speakers today. We'll be doing Q&A at the end, but if you don't have a chance to touch, if we don't get to touch on your question, you can reach out to HPNM using this form that I'm going to go ahead and show you here. And that'll be available under the offers tab throughout the call. We'll push it one final time at the end of the call. But please, if you want to follow up, they are a leading FDA law firm, and these are the experts you'd love to be speaking with. We're going to touch on a few housekeeping items. You can reduce your chance of buffering or any lag that you might have going on by closing any other apps you have running in the background. This webinar is going to be recorded, and it will be sent to you under the email address you registered at afterwards, so no need to ask for that. The slides are also available for download under the handouts section. There's no need to wait to the end to ask us questions. You can go ahead and pop those in the Q&A section throughout. We'll move them to the published section, and you can upvote questions that you would like to see answered. And we'll run a couple polls during the webinar. Those are completely optional, but we encourage you to participate just to get a better sense of how our audience feels about this issue. A little bit about Lighthouse. Lighthouse is the nation's leading and most trusted end-to-end full-service medical laboratory consulting and recruiting firm. That's how we keep these events free. Whether you're looking to start up a lab or grow your current business, we offer labs a way to accelerate their success. And I also have one offer I'd like to mention quickly here related to us at Lighthouse. We are in the process of finalizing a service offering to assist with FDA 510K submissions for new tests. For joining us today live on this call, we're offering a future 10% discount for labs that need help with this process. And keep in mind, tests marketed prior to May 6th will still need to meet certain requirements to maintain compliance with these new regulations, and that's something we can also assist with. So you can go ahead and take advantage of that offer through this tab. And again, that will be available under the offers section and shared again at the end. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Gail.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much to Lighthouse for putting this together. We are so happy to partner with you. I have to say, I wasn't expecting to be back here so soon. Some of you may remember a similar webinar when the proposed LDT rule was issued, and with lightning speed, FDA has issued the final rule. So here we are back again with you. And it's an immense topic. Jeff and I could spend hours talking. We have your lunch hour, which we appreciate. So try to cover as much ground in as much depth as we can. Breaking down, dissecting the anatomy of the final rule for you pathologists out there. Talking about the known and the unknown. So what do we know now about what will be required for laboratories, and what are the many questions that we have about how this final rule will be implemented in practice, and then what can laboratories do now? So last time we met and had this presentation, I gave you a lot of history and background of FDA and LDTs. Everybody knows that now. So jumping right into it, what was FDA's justification and rationale for issuing this final rule? So first, FDA responded to the many comments that said FDA did not have statutory authority under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to regulate LDTs, and asserted that it does, and explained the basis for its assertion. Second, FDA responded to the argument that LDTs are different from other devices, and that the device regulatory framework is not well suited. FDA disagreed with that, saying there's little distinction between test systems manufactured by labs and other manufacturers. IVD and LDT test systems look the same, function the same way, and regardless of who manufactures them. And that there's nothing inherent in the nature or the design of laboratory developed test systems that would justify excluding LDTs from FDA's jurisdiction. Then, FDA asserted many times throughout the proposed rule and the final rule that LDTs that are not regulated by FDA may cause harm to patients. FDA said they are aware of numerous examples of potentially inaccurate, unsafe, ineffective, or poor quality IVDs offered as LDTs that caused or may have caused patient harm. Now, FDA uses the phrase IVDs offered as LDTs to refer to LDTs. We will be just saying LDT. A lot of the harm that FDA alleged exists with respect to LDTs, they say comes from their internal information, doing inspections or meeting with potential sponsors that they gathered during review of EUAs. So non-public information that we really can't evaluate. FDA further argued in response to the many comments that raised concern about the enormous cost and adverse impact of that cost on laboratories and therefore patients. FDA asserted that the benefits of regulating LDTs as devices would significantly outweigh the cost. FDA prepared an economic impact assessment in which it asserted that the benefits would be between $0.99 billion to $11 billion. While the costs would be only $566 million to $3.56 billion. Okay, so getting to the anatomy, what did FDA actually change? This is perhaps the shortest regulation FDA has ever issued in the history of rulemaking. The final rule consists of the addition of 10 words to FDA's definition of an IVD, and the rest is 160 pages of justification and commentary. So what FDA says is through this rulemaking, FDA is amending the definition of an in vitro diagnostic product in its regulations to state that IVDs are devices under the FD&C Act, including when the manufacturer of these products is a laboratory. That's it. Nothing more in the regulations about how FDA will roll this out, what it means in practice. The rest is guidance, and even perhaps less than guidance. It's just FDA's informal explanation in the preamble. FDA further said that it intends to regulate LDTs under the same enforcement approach as IVDs. In other words, laboratories are the same as manufacturers of other medical devices and IVDs, and LDTs are equivalent to IVDs. So what does that mean in practice, and how is FDA going to roll this out? FDA talks about a phase-out policy beginning a year from May 6th, which is when the rule was issued. So 2025, going all the way through 2028. And let me just walk through what will happen at each of those stages. So starting within 1 year of May 6th, 2024, so in other words, May 6th, 2025, labs must have procedures in place to comply with corrections and removals, medical device reporting, and complaint handling. So unpacking what all of those things in detail would take more than the time we have, but I just want to give you a flavor of what is included under these regulatory provisions. So first of all, what is a correction? A correction is defined as a repair, modification, adjustment, relabeling, destruction, or inspection of a device without physically removing it from point of use, whereas removal of a device is, as it sounds like, the physical removal of a device for repair, modification, adjustment, relabeling, destruction, or inspection. Depending on the reason for implementing the correction or the removal, the manufacturer may need to report the action to FDA, in particular if it's done to reduce a risk of health or to remedy a violation of the Food and Drug Act that may cause a risk to health. Corrections and removals can also trigger recalls. So for example, many laboratories include next generation sequencing platforms, which are regulated by FDA as medical devices. If the manufacturer of that platform were to identify a cybersecurity vulnerability, that could trigger a recall of the NGS platform. So that is what happens to a traditional device. FDA is saying we will impose that correction and removal framework on laboratories and their LDTs. Similarly, medical device reporting is another potential consequence of corrections and removals. If there's an adverse event that has been identified as associated with a device, so harm, injury to a patient, or even a malfunction of a device that could cause harm in the future, an adverse event report needs to be filed with FDA, and those are public. So stage 2, starting 2 years after the final rule publication date, labs need to register their establishment with FDA and list each individual LDT. This is basically how regulated entities tell FDA they exist and what they do. Then LDTs must comply with FDA labeling requirements. And here again, the single word labeling doesn't really capture the extent of it. In particular, since under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it is a violation subject to penalty if any aspect of labeling is false and misleading in any particular. And for traditional medical devices, labeling also includes having a unique code called UDI on each device. So labeling encompasses everything you say in the label and in accompanying materials. And starting in 2026, laboratories will need to comply with that. And then finally, in 2026, labs that are doing clinical research with their LDTs will need to comply with the investigational device requirements applicable to other medical devices. Moving to stage 3, beginning in 2027, laboratories will have to implement the quality system requirements in 21 CFR Part 820. So FDA has said they will accept some of the existing CLIA requirements for high complexity laboratories in lieu of Part 820, but in particular, labs will still have to comply with what's called design controls. These are a set of quality practices and procedures to control the design process and assure that a device meets user needs, intended uses, and specified requirements for design input, design output, design review, design verification, design validation, design transfer, and design changes. And it includes the requirement to maintain a design history file for each type of device that is manufactured. So getting to what likely is of greatest concern, starting in 2027, high-risk LDTs, so those corresponding to Class 3 medical devices, will be required to submit pre-market approval applications, as well as humanitarian device exemptions, biologic license applications. In other words, pre-market review requirements for the highest risk devices. And while their submission is pending, they can continue until FDA makes a final decision. Then finally, in 2028, low and moderate class, which means Class 1 and Class 2 LDTs that require pre-market notification or de novo submission must comply with those requirements. And again, while their submissions are pending, they can remain on the market. So there's a lot of requirements associated with pre-market review. Again, can't go into that, but there's also a financial requirement associated with these submissions. So registration with FDA is $7,653. The requirement to submit a PMA is about $490,000 in 2024. 510Ks are about $22,000, and de novos are about $145,000, and that's per device. Now, a big change, perhaps the biggest change that FDA made between the proposed rule and the final rule is while they're phasing out general enforcement discretion, they are maintaining certain categories of enforcement discretion on a category by category basis. And there's different levels, different amounts of enforcement discretion that FDA is applying depending on the category. So 1976 type LDTs are those that use manual techniques. They're not automated. They use legally marketed components, and they're performed within a single CLIA high complexity lab. So, for example, manual immunohistochemical and lateral flow tests. Then there is certain things that are done in conjunction with transplantation. Tests performed within the Veteran Health Administration or DoD. For our purposes, the key ones are LDTs approved by New York State's Clinical Laboratory Evaluation Program, which already reviews LDTs for those labs that want to offer their LDTs to residents of the state of New York. But that will not be an exemption, enforcement discretion from all requirements, even with New York State authorization approval for the test, they will still be required to comply with the quality system. And they, like several other of these categories, will be required to submit their labeling to FDA so FDA can see the types of claims that are being made for the product. Moving on, LDTs for unmet needs used in an integrated healthcare system. So that's a healthcare system that develops an LDT to meet the unmet needs of its patient population will be exempt, subject to enforcement discretion for pre-market review, but not for the other requirements. And then finally, currently marketed LDTs, meaning those that were marketed prior to May 6, 2024, will not have to submit pre-market submissions, but they will be subject to the other requirements, including to submit labeling for FDA review, as long as they don't make any significant changes to their product. So if they, for example, change indications for use, change the technology, or make other types of change to the test, then they will lose that enforcement discretion. So just a word about enforcement discretion. It is not a carve-out. It is not an exemption. And FDA says this several times in the final rule. Enforcement discretion means, from FDA's perspective, a device is illegal. It's in violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, but FDA is choosing, for the moment, not to exercise its authorities and not to prosecute the violator. But FDA can change its mind without prior notice if FDA has a concern about a specific LDT. So with that, and then important last note about the anatomy of the rule. Certain things that were asked for by many commenters were not included. There was no enforcement discretion for academic medical centers or for small labs, but FDA said that its limited enforcement discretion policies would in practice cover many of those groups. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff for the second half of the presentation.
Thanks, Gail. So clearly this was a rule that attracted a lot of interest, and FDA received over 6,700 comments, and many of them are comments that were individually crafted. FDA sometimes gets huge numbers of comments, but they're cookie cutter. Here there are a lot of ones from different organizations representing very different perspectives, making different kinds of arguments. And some were supportive of the proposal, some were critical, some were generally supportive but wanted to make changes. So you can see that there is a wide range of stakeholders and interested parties that submitted comments. Many of the comments, the great majority, were rejected, and FDA spent a lot of time, hundreds of pages in the draft, in the form of the pre-publication version, explaining why they were rejecting those comments. Next. Slide control. There we go. So comments had major themes. Many of those had to do with what are the definitions and what are LDTs, diagnostic, laboratory equipment, having to do with whether FDA should be regulating these products at all, these products being the LDTs. A lot of comments were on the current state of the LDT market. One of the things that's remarkable in both the proposed rule and final rule is how many times FDA acknowledges in the preamble and also in the economic analysis that it doesn't really have a lot of information, that there are a lot of assumptions. And so companies try to present information about the state of the market, including things like cost. There are multiple comments about CLIA and accrediting organization oversight. The point being, LDTs are regulated. These are not something that are just out there on the market without oversight. FDA, in general, gave those little weight. Basically, FDA is saying that unless we at FDA are reviewing the clinical validity, we don't have much confidence in the test, and we believe that all these LDTs should be subject to the scrutiny of FDA, except for those that are exempt for one reason or another, and the greater regulatory requirements that we have. Many comments argue there was not sufficient justification for greater FDA oversight. FDA strongly asserted in the proposed rule that the LDTs were high risk. Companies responded and said, yes, we do not agree, yet you have overstated the risk. FDA pretty much brushed off all of those comments. There were comments saying you're going to lose small labs. FDA does acknowledge that it's likely that labs will close, that there will be consolidation, but in the end, FDA did not think that that was a major downside to finalizing the rule. There are many comments about reduced access to tests. They're going to be tests that will not be available. FDA also brushed that aside, in part because of the changes that it made that Gail just described, where there are some exceptions to enforcement, the phase out of enforcement discretion, so that continued access would be maintained. Of course, FDA also elsewhere does acknowledge that as time goes by, some of those exemptions may no longer apply, as, for example, labs change your test. So perhaps it's true in the short run that there'll be less impact on small labs, reduced access testing, but FDA, at least implicitly, it admits that that will not necessarily be the long-term effect. Many were concerned about the loss of resiliency because of emerging health threats, for example, COVID being a stark example of what happens if you don't have that. There are many comments about the negative patient population impact. FDA addressed that part by allowing continued access to tests and also that special exception for within a healthcare system and disincentivizing innovation. FDA largely dismissed that as well, saying that in fact it believes that this will incentivize a lot of innovation because companies will not have the competition from labs. In describing FDA's responses to these comments, I certainly would not want to be construed as endorsing. There are a lot of problems with what FDA said in responding to the comments and giving shorter shrift to these issues than I believe FDA should have. So there are lots of other issues that this raise. Let's see. So the FDA, there's a lot of discussion about legal issues. I'm assuming that most people on the phone on this webinar are not going to be as interested in some of the details to that, but certainly to lawyers, very, very important kinds of topics. For example, there was a lot of discussion about are labs in interstate commerce, and that's a fundamental legal issue because FDA's jurisdiction in many cases is pitched to to interstate commerce and commercial distribution. FDA said that made a number of comments saying we have jurisdiction over the LDTs, even though they don't travel in interstate commerce because the products that are used in them do travel in interstate commerce, or the tests are marketed in interstate commerce, or we don't even need interstate commerce, we have broad authority. There are concerns about FDA's lack of resources. Many commenters noted that during COVID, FDA simply didn't have sufficient resources. FDA is pointing to the user fee negotiations that will occur in the upcoming years, and that will give them resources. I would note, though, that a lot of work is going to be needed before FDA gets to hire those extra people. So when it comes to things like pre-submissions for the 510Ks, de novos, and PMAs that Gail talked about, one should be concerned about FDA having sufficient resources. The FDA did add some categories, as Gail noted, that will address concerns about the adverse economic impact to some degree. They certainly ameliorate it, but they don't remove those concerns, at least not in my view. There are still going to be significant disruptions in the landscape as a result of this rule. And FDA does say that publics at risk from LDTs that FDA has not determined are safe and effective. Implicit in that is that it's up to FDA and only FDA to determine safety and effectiveness. One of the changes between the proposed rule and the final rule is that FDA does acknowledge here in a kind of begrudging fashion that LDTs can be effective. But in doing its economic analysis, FDA does not consider the loss of those effective LDTs when considering cost. So if certain LDTs are effective and are no longer available as a result of this rule, FDA does not consider that to be a cost imposed by the rule. There are comments about what about CLIA? Well, CLIA will continue to apply. But there'll be some overlap and duplication. FDA largely dismissed that. There's certainly going to be questions about the medical device reporting or MDR regulation. For example, what is a malfunction? That's been an issue for IVD manufacturers for years, trying to determine precisely what is malfunction. Those issues will apply here. How is FDA going to apply the quality system regulation in practice? Given there is some overlap with CLIA, FDA minimizes that overlap, but it's still there, which will impose some extra cost. How many LDTs are going to be eligible for 510Ks in practice? A lot of these tests are new. That's why they're LDTs. FDA may have this vision of many LDTs are basically similar to what's on the market with other through kits, but there are many products that I'm aware of that do not have predicates. And if the proportion of de novos and PMAs, particularly de novos, is higher than FDA expects, then the cost to industry will be much greater and the burdens on FDA will be greater because de novos are more labor intensive. FDA reserves the authority to go after a poor performing test. There are no criteria. That really is very much in the eye of the beholder. In this case, the FDA is the beholder. And FDA talks about labeling, but labs don't distribute labeling. So what exactly does labeling mean? It's clear that there's going to be a need for a lot of guidance from FDA as this rule unfolds. There are many, many questions that remain unanswered. And if the rule survives, then there will be a lot of need for greater clarity. So what can you do now for those labs? So one is I would get familiar with the stage 1 regulatory controls, which would be having a system for reviewing complaints for the MDRs, corrections, removals, and plan for establishing those kinds of procedures. And think about what you might do for hiring, training personnel, and for software. But I would not do anything right now because there will be time, and as I'll discuss in a moment, it's not absolutely 100% certain what the fate of this rule will be. I would also begin thinking about what the pathway will be for tests, particularly for complex tests that are likely to be de novo or PMA. Again, I would not spend time or money working on submissions yet, but I would begin thinking about that because particularly for high-risk devices that are PMAs, 3.5 years goes by quickly, and if you need to have it submitted in 3.5 years from June 6th, that time is going to be short. However, again, I would minimize cost in the short run because there are possibilities that this rule will be altered in some way or struck down. So the LDT debate's been going on for 32 years. FDA first issued a compliance policy guide in 1992 talking about its authority to regulate LDTs, back then called home brews. I wouldn't say it's a final chapter, but if the rule survives, it's going to profoundly affect diagnostic testing in the United States, not just for labs, but the whole industry in some unforeseen ways. Now, as far as we go back to one slide, what might happen? Although the debate's been going on for 32 years, we now have a final rule. There are 3 ways in which it might change. One is there could be litigation, and the rule could be struck down. Second is Congress could act. As I imagine most people on the call know, Congress considered the Ballot Act for over the years. Ballot would be a legislative fix. And FDA just indicated yet again this very week that they would be interested in ballot. A lot of stakeholders are interested in ballot. The adoption of this rule may put more pressure on Congress and various parties to come together on legislation. So there is that possibility. And third is the election in November. I don't know what will happen with the election. If the Republicans were to win, I can't say that the rule would be put on hold. However, given that all this is entirely discretionary, as Gail mentioned, the regulatory part is just a few words. It would be very easy for a new administration to put this on hold or substantially modify the terms of this. So those are 3 events: legislation, litigation, and election that could have a bearing on what happens with the rule. And we should know about all those in the next few months, November being the last of the events to find out. We'll certainly know by November about the election, and the other 2, perhaps before then. So with that, we'll open up to questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you both, Jeff and Gail. That was excellent. Really quick here before we hop into questions, just want to mention to everybody that we're going to have a webinar later this month as well. This will be covering the FTC's recent ruling that bans non-compete agreements in many instances. If you'd like to sign up for that event, you can go ahead and use that button there. And those handout offers are also available to follow up with Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara or Lighthouse Lab Services under the handouts offers section. And we're going to go ahead and hop into Q&A. I've got a little tree trimming going on in the background, so I do apologize if we're picking up any noise from that. Okay. We're going to go ahead and just work our way down from some of the most upvoted questions. If we're not able to touch on anything today, Jeff and Gail will let you know, and I encourage you to follow up with them offline. This is from Andrew. A lot of the newly imposed regulations are directed towards user facilities or manufacturers and the associated distributed tests. Could you define these three terms, if possible, in the context to academic labs that make and perform tests in-house and do not traditionally distribute out? And Gail and Jeff, if I'm talking a little fast or anything's garbled, you can look on Q&A published. I'm reading down from the top.
Yeah, Gail, I think that's in your area.
Sorry, I was just looking for the question. I wanted to see the words. Who is it from?
That's Andrew Galinsky, and the top question under Q&A and published. Looking for more clarification on the user facilities, manufacturers, and associated distributed tests.
Well, so I think it depends. There is no enforcement discretion for academic medical centers, who I'm assuming you would be included among those offering distributed tests. But there is this enforcement discretion if the test is being offered within a single healthcare institution. How that's defined, I couldn't tell you today. It could be defined very narrowly or broadly. And to be subject to enforcement discretion, that health facility has to be performing a test only for its patient population to meet an unmet need in its patient population. So there's a lot to unpack there.
Okay, thank you, Gail. We're going to move on to a question from Tyler Vine. With all LDTs being considered IVDs and the FDA requiring IVDs to be manufactured by ISO certified sites, what ISO certifications are high complexity labs going to be expected to acquire?
Well, when the QSR regulation involving harmonization is not yet in effect, but FDA has made it clear that it expects that regulation as revised to take effect and apply here. So the ISO regulations requirements are going to be exactly the same for labs and for conventional manufacturers by the time this kicks in.
All right, thanks for that answer, Jeff. This is from Francis. If a RUO is currently being used, will the responsibility of moving to IVD be on the manufacturer or the lab?
So that is $1 million question. It's a terrific question, and I think we really do not know. FDA has certainly made it clear that they are not fans of the use of RUO reagents in LDTs. This could certainly be an opportunity for FDA to clamp down on that practice. But on whom the burden will fall primarily? Jeff, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I think that probably the way it's going to play out, and there's no certainty, but this is what I would expect, is that FDA would allow RUO products to continue to be shipped, but the company using it, which would be the lab, would be responsible for validating and ensuring that they have a quality agreement with the supplier and taking responsibility for the performance of that component. If you think of the RUO as being a component of an entire test system, and that the burden will fall on the lab to do that. Now, the companies making RUO products may decide that that could dampen sales, and so they will pursue their own FDA clearance, but that's a pretty big shift for RUO suppliers, to go from being a product that's not regulated by FDA to one that is fully regulated by FDA. So I suspect in many cases, the burden is going to be on the labs to take responsibility and enter into quality agreements with the RUO supplier.
All right, thanks for touching on that one. Got a question here from Julie. If a lab needs to modify an existing quote unquote grandfathered test on the market prior to May 6, 2024, does the regulation indicate that they can make the change now and offer it to their patients? But later, will they need to meet all the requirements by the deadline of each phase? It's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah,
It's a good question, but if you guys need clarification, go ahead and take a look at it.
No, it's essentially, I think the question is, what about labs who want to launch, either change or launch a new test between now and the stage of the rule when pre-market submissions are required? My read of the final rule is that you can modify or launch now, but will be subject to the stages when they arrive.
Yep, and I agree. So what that functionally means is that if you want to make a change now in a test that was on the market on May 6th, that will trigger the need to make the submissions on the appropriate schedule. So right now that there's plenty of time, but making changes as you get closer to the deadline becomes more and more problematic. And so I can imagine labs are going to have to look at the clock and the value of making the change and deciding whether it's going to be worthwhile. Maybe they get a year of marketing before they have to submit, but then they're going to have to submit. And so is it going to be worth that change? One of the areas that has gotten very little attention is the part where labs who are buying kits from manufacturers and make changes of a type that would require a new 510K from a 510K holder also need to submit to FDA. The FDA will treat that as a new kind of test, not grandfathered. And that's something which is a very common practice among labs, and I think it's going to create an immense amount of confusion, and yet has gotten virtually no attention out there.
Well, thanks for touching on that one and for clarifying my word salad up front a little bit.
It's complicated. This is really messy.
It certainly is.
For a 10-word rule, FDA has managed to introduce hundreds of complexities and complications and all sorts of questions about what ifs.
Absolutely. We got another one here from Elizabeth, and we've got a few different questions that are touching on costs. And I know we reviewed that on an earlier slide, but would it be possible for us to go into a little bit more detail on costs? When you talk about the fees, are you quoting fees directly or a full analysis of what it costs for a lab to implement a proper QMS and meet the needs of these submissions?
Yeah, the fees that I was quoting were just for registration and for making a pre-market submission for an application for a device. And I think there was also a question that I saw pop up about what will be considered sort of the product, whether it would be by analyte or by test system. I don't think we know that for sure. Is it for every entry that you have in your CLIA listing, because you have to list all the tests you perform? Would each of those be the test? I think there's some ambiguity about what FDA will think is the product that is subject to the fee.
And I think of the questions on fee, that FDA did try to calculate what the fees are, but I think FDA's estimates are woefully low because they don't include all of the costs. The fees for registering your product and for going through listing are pretty straightforward, although I've been struck by how often companies, even experienced companies, have trouble making sense of the FDA process. But when you start getting to something even like MDRs, to set up a policy and then train people and make sure that it's working correctly, will be probably in the tens of thousands of dollars. I'm assuming that there'll be software out there that a lot of labs will be able to buy that will include procedures and policies for that and templates. Still, it's going to take time training. But when you get to the 510K, PMA, and de novo, those costs can be very, very high for doing all the analytical testing that FDA wants, and the clinical study, and the submission, and hiring regulatory consultants and staffing up. There are a lot of extra costs that are built into the system now that were not pre May 6th.
All right, thank you both for touching on that one. We got a lot of questions about this. Could we provide some clarification on how high-risk devices are defined?
Sure. So a class 3 device is defined in the statute as one that is cannot be made safe through general or special controls, and so requires pre-market submission to ensure its safety and effectiveness. That's a paraphrase of the statute. It tends to be for high risk, such as implanted devices, those that are necessary for life-saving or preventing serious disease. How does that map onto an LDT? We have a few examples where FDA has treated an LDT as a class 3, and those are companion diagnostics. So if a test is necessary for the safe and effective use of a drug, then FDA requires that there be a approved diagnostic for that drug, and those are considered high risk.
Right. At the same time, some FDA is trying to move some of these high risk PMAs down to class 2 to down classify. So there may be fewer PMAs than there historically have been. And that's one of the rationales FDA gives for reducing the cost in its estimates, because some of the things that might have been class 3 are going to move to class 2, and the cost for a PMA are much higher than for de novo. But again, there are going to be ambiguities and uncertainties, and companies that are not sure are going to have to interact with FDA early on because it will affect the pathway and the work that you have to do. If it's a PMA, there's more work, shorter timeline, and so companies that are on the bubble will need to investigate where they fall.
All right, thank you both again. On this next one, I've heard a few different comments in regard to how this might impact LDTs for LCMS confirmation toxicology testing on urine samples. In particular, this questioner is asking if a small, high complexity CLIA physician office lab doing that type of testing might be exempt.
I can't think of a reason why they would be exempt if it's an LDT. Assuming it's an LDT, there's no exemption for doctors' offices.
All right, thanks, Jeff. We had a few different questions related to physician office labs specifically, so that's helpful. Next question here. This commenter says they'd love to hear what you have to say about LDTs used for clinical trials. Will all assays used as LDTs in clinical trial fall under the investigational drug exemption?
Jeff, you want me to kick that one off?
Well, they're clinical trials for the device, and then they're clinical trials to support a drug. And what FDA says in the rule is that if it's a clinical study that would need an investigational device exemption or IDE, then the labs will have to get an IDE. I would note that there are very few IDEs that are granted for IVDs today. It's unusual. On the drug side, if it's supportive, then it's an interesting question. I don't think FDA has addressed it. It may well be with the Center for Drugs or Center for Biologics as to what they want. If the test is being used to generate data to support an application for an NDA or BLA, new drug application or biological license application, then historically the pharmaceutical company could decide to take the risk and use the test data even though the test had not been approved by FDA. I'm not sure there's anything in the rule that would force a change on this because the test is not being used to diagnose in the context of a pharma study. It's being used to generate data. So it's possible that in that situation, CEDAR or CBER would allow the clinical study to use an LDT. But Gail, I don't know of anything that directly addresses that point.
No.
I think it's going to put a burden on the drug sponsor to find out what the status is. And if in fact there's now a requirement that these tests the assays be approved or cleared by CDRH in order to support a drug trial, that could have significant ripple effects on the drug side. And I'm not talking about companion diagnostics. I'm talking about other kinds of tests that are used to measure endpoints that would support evidence of safety and effectiveness for that trial. That's a great question. And yeah. I don't think that our drug colleagues have really thought through the implications of this rule.
But just on the device side, it can have significant ramifications. So a number of years ago, there was an NIH studied multi-center study of gene sequencing in infants. It was a longitudinal study. The study was not of the sequencing itself. It was using standard methods that was being used to evaluate the value of gene sequencing. FDA took the position that because of that sequencing was being done in the context of a study, FDA needed to review it, which had consequences in terms of many, many months of delays for some of those who were involved in that study.
All right. Well, thanks again for touching on that one. We have one from Amanda here. She notes, even FDA-approved tests are not 100% accurate. Would all identified inaccurate results or failed PT need to be reported to the FDA by the lab, since this could be interpreted as having the potential to lead to patient harm?
What a great question. That's exactly one of the elements we put in our comments to FDA. So to take a step back, FDA in the proposed rule asserted that LDTs presented risk because they weren't always accurate. And one of our comments was, that's also true for IVDs that go through the manufacturing process. It's true for both kinds of products. You don't have perfection. There's no test, virtually no test that's 100% sensitive and specific. In the final rule, FDA did note that the IVDs do have some errors, and also noted that it's inherent in the nature of the product that there will be inaccurate results. You can have sensitivity of 93% and specificity of 95%. And so that gets to a question that's been around long before LDTs, and that is, what do you do when you get a report of an erroneous result in a product that is not designed to be perfect? So that's a bigger question than this rule. It has to do with how do you decide what's reportable, whether it's with an LDT or a manufactured product, if the result is wrong. And FDA has never directly answered that question when it comes to IVDs. So it's a long way of saying it's a great question. It's been a great question for a while. Existing kits are not perfect. What do you do? And FDA is not really given guidance on what you do for MDR reports with products that are inherently imperfect. I think the practical answer is you look at it, and if it's the kind of errors that you typically see, you don't submit a report to FDA. If you see a trend or you learn something very specifically wrong with the product, that's a different question.
Great answer there, Jeff. Gina's asking about personnel costs. It's going to be a significant cost, especially considering that the fate of the rule is uncertain. But that aside, could you describe the type of personnel labs should be looking to hire, or is this more of a wait and see?
I think that
is there anybody, or is it outside counsel potentially that?
I don't want to give a self-serving answer and say, well, the first thing you should do is hire an FDA lawyer, because that is not the right answer either. It is something, I'm afraid that over time, if this were to go into effect, that there will be a lot of outside consultants and costs that will be incurred, not just lawyers, but regulatory consultants, biostatisticians, software experts, clinical experts, contract research organizations. So there are going to be a host of people who have to be hired. Regulatory and quality, though, would probably the ones that you would look to first. And there's really a shortage of people, in my experience, of good regulatory and quality people who know the IVD industry. IVD being a little bit more of a niche than other fields. So to find really good people in that area is going to be challenging. And if I were a lab and I happen to come upon someone like that, even though I might be worried about incurring extra costs now, as a insurance policy, I might grab that person. Getting into the regulatory quality world for IVDs, if the rule survives, is going to be a great career opportunity for a lot of people.
Well, thanks for sharing that insight.
Gail, do you have anything on that?
Nope, can't add to that.
So I was joking with someone at FDA just a couple of days ago about how when it came to analyzing the costs and benefits of this, that the benefits could include people that for some people will be a full employment act, that people in quality and regulatory who know diagnostics are not going to lack for employment as long as this rule is in effect. Maybe not in the first couple of months, but over time, it is going to mean a lot of people will need to be hired to fill those posts.
Jeff and Gail, how are we feeling? If we go 5 minutes past the top of the hour, are you good to answer some more questions? Or we can call it here.
No, yeah, one or two more. It sounds great.
Okay, we'll take two more. Before I do that, I'm just going to do one more here. If your question hasn't been addressed yet, please, you've seen how great our speakers are here today. Follow up with them. They can be in contact with you and try to help get that addressed. And then again, too, if down the line you feel like you need help with your submission, we're going to be offering a discount to anybody here on today's call. So go ahead and fill out that form and we will be in touch with you. As for these final couple questions from Elizabeth, who or what agencies will be overseeing the actual audits on these rules? Will local DPHs now be responsible for CLIA renewal and FDA quality regulatory review?
So nothing in the final rule changes, at least on paper, anything about CLIA. The state CLIA programs will still be responsible for CLIA, and FDA will be responsible for the implementation of the medical device provisions of the Act to laboratories. An unanswered question is what happens when CLIA conflicts with FDA requirements, which I think is completely foreseeable. You know, who's going to win? How is that going to be resolved?
Yeah, and at that point, Gail, there's a really interesting aspect where with CLIA, the lab director has to sign out a report and answer questions potentially, and some of those questions could involve off-label use. FDA in the rule seems to think that that's not a problem. Historically, manufacturers have been have had to be careful about this. It looked like FDA might be giving more discretion to lab directors in describing off-label use than would be the case, but that's something that will require greater clarification. But there will be conflicts. Gail's absolutely right. There are going to be conflicts between the two, and FDA might shrug them off, but they'll exist.
All right, we're going to go ahead and ask our last question here. This has been a marathon Q&A. Thanks again to Jeff and Gail. This has been excellent. I hope all of you have gotten a lot of information out of this. Last question here from Michelle Taylor. If you work for a private company that owns multiple laboratories, and in this instance, these would be distinct CLIA laboratories that are not located near each other, will submissions be per CLIA lab?
I would assume that the company, which in a situation like that, would try to get a 510K that covered all the facilities, assuming that the tests are standardized, rather than submitting one for each lab. And if each test is the same and the data are the same, it may be that there will be a single umbrella 510K or de novo that would apply to each. There may need to be analytical data for each lab that would be included in the submission, but I don't think you would need to have, say, 8 510Ks for 8 labs that make the exact same product. It might also be that at that point, companies say, we'll get into the kit world and do it that way, which would clearly be a single 510K or de novo.
All right.
It's another one of those, so many scenarios that are not addressed. And, you have the 160 pages in the Federal Register, you have all the economic analysis. There's so many things that people can come up and say, what if, what about this, what about that? And all that's going to take time to answer. And FDA is going to have to spend a lot of time coming up with guidance. And one of my fears is that a lot of these questions are not going to be answered in a timely or clear manner. And,
right. As many questions as we have come up with in the last, it's hard to believe it's only about 2 weeks. In this hour, I've heard some questions I hadn't thought of that are, just extremely complicated.
Definitely. It's safe to say there's a lot more clarity to come. Well, I just want to say thank you again to both Jeff and Gail and everyone at HP&M. This was a great event. We really appreciate their time. And please go ahead and follow up with them if you have any additional questions. This recording will be available later this afternoon for anybody who wasn't able to attend. So watch for that in your inbox. Thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.